Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the New Books Network podcast in Ukrainian Studies. I'm your host, John Shetichka. Joining me today is Dr. Andrii Portnov, who is professor of Entangled History of Ukraine at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt. He graduated from universities in Dnipro and Warsaw, and he defended his PhD dissertation in Lviv. He has conducted research and lectured in places such as Amsterdam, Basel, Berlin, Brussels, Cambridge, Geneva, Lyon, Paris, Potsdam, and Vienna. His publications are devoted to intellectual history, historiography, genocide, and memory studies in Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. Today, we will discuss Andrii's recent book entitled Dnipro, An Entangled History of a European City. The book was published in 2022 by Academic Studies Press. Andrii, thank you so much for joining me on the New Book Network's podcast today.
Hello, my pleasure.
So this book is just really amazing, Andrii, on so many levels, I think, because it combines so many aspects of history. It's intellectual, it's about a city, non-human actors, it's about multiculturalism, it's about nationalism, it's about empire, it's about all these wonderful things. And one thing that sort of immediately stood out to me was that your book acts as a biography of a city, which I'm sure you get told a lot. And I think more than just a biography, it can also be read as a local history, but a local history that's situated in international history and European history, and even a micro history of a city. But I hate to call it a micro history because it also works within the ebbs and flows of different histories that are going on over the course of several hundred years. But what I think is really remarkable is your ability to talk about the city within larger historical processes, is what we do as historians. So I want to start just by asking you to talk more about why you chose to write about Dnipro and why you think its history is important for helping us understand Ukraine and European history more broadly.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So I should probably start with the point that the idea on using a decision to write a biography. That's a good term. A biography of Dnipro came to my mind many years ago. So when I say many, it means more than 10 years ago. And so, frankly speaking, the original plan was to quickly write and publish a book for, let's say, Ukrainian and international audience. And when I kind of planned and even announced it for the first time in Kiev, as I said, 10 years ago, which means the city's official name was Dnipropetrovsk over then. So this is the Soviet version of it, right? And the political situation in Ukraine was very different from what we have now, right? And it was even before the outbreak of war, as we all know now. Of course, the real outbreak was in 2014, even though it was not a full-scale war as we have it now. So, and then for for different reasons, maybe no time to go into details right now, but this process of writing took me much longer time. And on the one hand, I'm happy about it because, as we all know, if you write longer, you have you could find new sources, you could rewrite some parts, again and again. On the other hand, I'm asking myself pretty seriously, why still I ended up in 2021. So the manuscript was almost finished in 21. Yeah, and then published next year. Because again, it was published and it was like the final version of it, was prepared before the full-scale aggression. So again, we have a kind of academic text that was finished before those events that that are so important, of course, and relevant for all of us. And I also asking myself, okay, maybe it was too late or too early, depending on the, on the on our imagination of time and relevance of history. But I should mention that that's the story of a place where I was born and raised. And actually, it's maybe funny, I don't know, but when I was like a student, for instance, of history in Dnipro, for some reasons, it was not the local history that interested me the most. I was fascinated, with the Polish history, with methodology, with reading different, let's say, theoretical works by German, American, Polish historians, yeah. But later on, so when I went to Poland to do my second master degree, and then when I defended my dissertation in Lviv, and when I worked for shorter time periods, like in different places in Europe, you've mentioned, I've come to the conclusion that actually what I could do as a historian um, is the biography of my native city, if I may say so, like native, yeah, the place where I was born. And in doing that, I decided, and actually here I'm very grateful that you put it this way, because it was very important for me as well. I've decided to try my best not to produce a kind of, like local history per se, as we have them like a lot, let's say, in Ukrainian, for instance, like really local stuff that is almost, like, uh, let's say, not really understandable, let's put it this way, yeah, for people, even specialists who are not from that particular place, right? So my ambition was actually completely different. My ambition was to put this local history into broader context. So context of European history, sometimes world history, one could say, of course, like the First World War, the Second World War, but also into different, let's say, theoretical frameworks, if you wish. Yeah. So sometimes it's like the history of migration, sometimes the history of nationalism, sometimes the history of social movements, and even one could say the history of the working class, because the case of Dnipro, it's very much the history of industrialization, and let's say all the problems and challenges linked to revolutionary movements, and various types of social deviations, and so on. And then, at the like at the final stage of my work, I've realized that actually, if we're talking about English language historiography, English language books, we have no history of Dnipro at all. So we have some books about particular periods of the history, like, for example, the book by Sergei Zhuk, so my good friend and colleague, right? But his book is about one very specific particular issue, so culture and politics, culture and consumption in the Brezhnev era. That's it. But if you look for a book about the entire history, so let's say from the late 18th century to nowadays, I'm afraid my book will be like the first one to read. And here, of course, hmm, I am aware of the responsibility to being the author of the kind of like first synthesis of some particular place, because of course, as any synthetic book, this book is just, how to put it, it's just like my view on how the history of the place could be written, could be imagined, yeah, could be presented. There are a lot of aspects that are not mentioned at all, a lot of people who are absent because it was not enough space to put them all into it. And that is why I'm really curious, and I hope that some colleagues, they will, let's say, continue. They'll be encouraged by my publication. They'll be encouraged to go deeper into various periods and aspects of this city's history. And in my view, it's not for the sake of this place, even though it's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place, and of course, I really hope that relatively soon all of us will be able to go there again, to work in the archives, yeah, to visit the biggest Jewish community center in the world, and so on. But for me, it was an exercise in history writing, just a kind of an intellectual adventure. Yeah, so it was not kind of nostalgic book book about something like that. It was an exercise in writing history of different periods and different topics, and I'm actually very happy because for me it was also something like new, I would say, when I've started preparing this chapter about the 18th century, this stuff is, was not anymore. This stuff was completely new for me because I'm not a historian of the 18th century. So I've learned myself a lot through that, and I've tried to show this fascination these challenging possibilities of thinking about it with the readers. And then, of course, they will decide whether this task was accomplished or not.
Yeah, I mean, you've done a remarkable job, I think, with, as one of the first English language monographs on the city. It introduces us to a lot of things, and you cover a lot of ground, really. I mean, roughly from, the founding of it, and you basically go from, like 18th century up until present day. And I think you, for covering that much history, do a pretty good job of touching on a lot of important projects. And I think it's sort of interesting to hear you talk about too, returning to your sort of home city and thinking about what it's like to revisit it. A lot of us sort of move away from our home cities and don't want to think about it anymore, but you've done something unique and an intellectual exercise in returning home and navigating that. And I have a couple of questions based on what you just said. The first is, I think it is remarkable that this is your home city and, you're sort of um, place of birth. And I couldn't help but notice that you do sort of leave yourself out of the narrative in the book. And I'm sure that was intentional. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about the thought process and whether you were going to sort of include yourself in the book because you're part of the history that you're writing. But as an academic, you weigh these things of trying to produce an academic text. But I can see yourself in it a little bit, particularly in the sources that you used. I love the images that you use because a lot of them will say from your personal collection, which just shows me, you've collected parts of the history, you've collected parts of the city, and you have an archive, of the city yourself. And so, could you talk a little bit about why you decided not to write yourself into this history?
Yeah, that's one of the key questions for myself as well. I could tell you, I'm not sure whether it's the first time I'm saying that, but probably. Okay, let's believe that the first time. So I could admit that the original plan, so the very first original plan 10 years ago, it was actually about including myself very much into the narrative. Almost doing something like that, telling some story from my childhood and then explaining this story through the events that happened, many years before, or how, for instance, some street names or places, how they are linked to, and then name it to Russian imperial history, or to the Jewish past of the city, or to the Soviet experiments, and so on. And actually, who knows? Maybe I will still write such a book at some point. I don't know. But what happened actually? I've got a fellowship. I was very lucky. I was very lucky to get a fellowship from the Institute for Advanced Study, Berlin. That's actually how I came to Germany. So it sounds strange, maybe even crazy, but this book project about my hometown brought me to Germany. Yeah, nothing else. This book. So the plan was like that. I go to Berlin for 1 year, finish the manuscript, go back and continue my activities in Kiev. But exactly in this time period, something very, very important in Ukraine happened. I mean, the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan movement, and then the occupation of Crimea and the outbreak of war. And I remember actually this time. So I actually at that time period, so I was in Berlin, also giving some lectures at the universities in Berlin, and I've realized it was not like my personal decision. Together with the German colleagues, we've decided that there is a need to establish something, let's say, more or less regular about Ukrainian studies and Ukrainian topics in Germany. Because, as we all know now, this particular field was rather missing in these pretty broad so-called East European studies here. And actually, because of this decision, to initiate such a project, it was first called Berlin-Brandenburg Ukraine Initiative, then turned into Prisma Ukraine Research Network Eastern Europe, and then into my professorship at the Viadrina. So, first of all, it costed a lot of time in a sense that, unfortunately, for the book, I have had to focus on this work. And on the other hand, by doing this stuff, I mean, on the one hand, teaching, on the other hand, preparing different projects, thinking about joint German-Ukrainian projects. At some point, I've realized that maybe actually it wasn't now. I'm thinking now, like spontaneously. Maybe it was the influence of the German academic milieu. I don't know. I should think about it more. But at some point, I've realized that if I have to publish my book like right now. Yeah, so I failed to do it quicker. So now I should do it maybe not in a German way. I would not say like that, but in a let's use this definition in a purely academic style. And I've started rewriting already, existing chapters, believe me or not. So I have some previous versions in my computer. And actually, this new version was, as you rightly said, it was much less personal and much more, let's say, I wouldn't say neutral, but let me put it this way: it was much more open in a sense of possible interpretations for the readers. So I've really tried to give a cautious reader a chance to decide her or himself, sometimes even how to interpret particular quotes or materials or informations. And it was not done because I believed or I believe in, something like this, like, old-fashioned objectivity of history writing. I'm afraid we have no reason to believe it anymore. But I still think that there are different, let's say, types of engagement. Right. And my engagement in case of this particular book was to, again, being aware of the fact that it's the first English language synthesis of the city's biography, was to try my best to present this, like spectrum, the amount of informations and sources and traditions and whatever, and conflicts also, because the city's history was and still is full of conflicts and problems and so on. And not to focus too much on my own, let's say, personal experience, even if you wish as a child, let's say, in late Soviet Union. It's also like a fascinating topic in itself. But as I said, maybe for another book, not for this one. So the only thing where I still decided, let's say, to use this original plan was to include some information, some stuff that my father and my grandfather and my also grandmother collected, just living in the city. They are also looking into some photos from the family archive, but to use them as illustrations of the narrative and not as the main source, or let's say the main subject in itself. Again, whether it was a good decision, I don't know. It could be discussed. It could be discussed and questioned and whatsoever. But you see, again, I've tried. I've tried to avoid this, impression, because believe me, some people they even ask me about this kind of, implied motivation. Let's say to convince people how great my hometown is, or how fascinating. Yeah, I would say it's great, of course, but the point was different. The point was to show intellectual possibilities of like broad, comparative, if you wish, transnational for sure, thinking about this particular, this particular part of Ukraine in its history. And to do that, I decided to limit, let's say, to limit at least explicitly, my own presence in the book. But believe me, there are a lot of places where I could still, like write an additional, an additional personal comment or observation. But But as I said, who knows? Maybe at some point I'll use this stuff for another publication.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of craving that in the book. I was like, I want to know Andrii's interpretation. Was he at some of these events, later on in the book? And I think we're all really waiting for you to write, a biography of Andrii's Dnipro, That's going to be a great companion book in the future, and I think we'll all look forward to reading it. And I also think it's quite fascinating to hear you talk about this because the book, and your professorship is about the entanglements of European history and the entanglements of Ukraine as part of Europe in this process. And it's sort of fascinating to hear you talk about going to Germany and thinking about yourself as a Ukrainian entangled in a different European space, and then to use that sort of reflection to think back about your hometown. And I see a lot of that in the book, actually, and it's something that I think for listeners they'd be sort of interested to hear a little bit more about, which I think it's interesting when you write about, well, I guess at the time, would have been Katerinoslav, but people were comparing it to other European cities. And I find this sort of geographic thinking and imagination sort of interesting. It was, things like New Athens or one of the Manchesters. And you talk about this at length in one of your chapters about how, there have been many Manchesters across Europe and, in the Soviet Union as well. And they sort of become these industrial hubs and centers. But for whatever reason, Dnipro is not always thought of as one of those Manchesters. And it got me thinking about this. I think you bring up a crucial point about sort of industrialization and the onset of modernity and whatever that means in that context. But you also refer to this process. It brings in a lot of different people together in the cities, and you call it multicultural imperialism. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the ways that that sort of industrial and modern process helped to entangle what was then Katerinoslav with the rest of Europe, because they're sort of comparing this place in Ukraine or in the Russian Empire, but then later on in Soviet Ukraine and then, independent Ukraine, they've always been comparing it to other places in Europe. And in that way, they sort of think of it as, how do we fit this place into Europe? So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about that for our listeners who'd be sort of interested to hear about, that industrialization process there and what that meant to sort of locate it on the map in Europe.
Yeah, sure. So that was, and one could say still is, Dnipro, one of the European Manchesters. Yeah, as some journalists of the late 19th century nicely, in my view, put it, the southern Manchester, because we have a lot of northern Manchesters, right? Also in Finland, in Germany itself. Actually, believe me, I especially went to those German Manchesters to have a look. And I should tell you, you could feel, really, it sounds a bit crazy, but you could feel this common, let's say, experience of rapid industrialization. And then later on, quite often also followed by, all types of social problems and environmental problems and economic problems and so on. And this metaphor of Manchester was very popular indeed, very popular indeed. Okay, let's be frank. Let's stress it again. This industrialization of the late Russian Empire, so end of the 19th century, it was largely, actually predominantly, if you're talking about this particular region, so southern Ukraine, financed and organized, if you wish, by the enterprises, private enterprises from the Western Europe. Again, if you look at the names even of the people who invested, millions of dollars, as we say nowadays, into Katerinoslav, they were mostly French and Belgian businessmen. In case of Donbass, actually so Donetsk, it was part of this huge Yekaterinoslav government, right? We are talking about British businessmen. So again, it's fascinating that the late Russian Empire allowed or even supported, if you wish, this incredible participation of the foreign capital, foreign investments in developing industry there, without money, and then also engineers, also people who came, like physically came there to install all this stuff from France, Belgium, Britain, partly Germany. We could not imagine this rapid development of this place. Absolutely not. So it was indeed entangled. It was just part of the European economic development, this rapid capitalist development, right, of the late 19th century. And then it was followed by the Soviet, let's say, Soviet particular, very interesting, very violent story of industrialization. And then after the Second World War, even like more fascinated, if you wish, story of the Soviet violent rocket so nuclear war, Cold War / Cold War industrialization, which occurred exactly in Dnipro, already in the late 40s and then 50s, 60s, 70s. So in this sense, the city was indeed directly linked to Western Europe, to Central Europe. For instance, during the First World War, some plants, so the entire production was moved from Warsaw and Riga to Dnipro. So like western parts of the Russian Empire, because the front line was not so far away. And even nowadays, if you go, and actually I did it also myself, of course, so in the Polish capital, so in Warsaw, where I was a student, as you've mentioned, you could still go to a street which is called Stalowa, so the steel street, and that's the name given after the plant that existed there, but then was removed to Dnipro during the First World War. And so you have the name, no object anymore, but it's like the presence of history, if you know the story, of course. Right. And in this sense, again, one could say that you have this interesting intellectual, let's say, tension between the idea of entanglement and idea of belonging actually to the all European economic system, and another very important idea, especially like post Second World War, idea of the city closed for the foreigners, and closed again because of this rocket industry. And one could even say, if you wish, it is not in my book, but it's about like speculating afterwards, that if you're looking for like the explanatory trends in the city's history, one could say that on the one hand, you have this like trend of integration into, like broader world economic structures. On the other hand, you have this idea of isolation, secretness, and stuff like that. And actually, even if you look, let's say, in pretty recent, so like independent Ukraine years, you'll see this kind of competition, if you wish, in the city mythology. On the one hand, the presence of this interesting idea that the Brezhnev years, so the years of city closedness, were actually the golden age of the city because of, higher social standards, demographic growth, stuff like that. On the other hand, on the contrary, you have this idea that exactly this closedness was the biggest obstacle for city development. And until this full-scale war, one of the biggest issues in Dnipro was the issue of the international airport. Because unfortunately, uh, so the airport was not good enough. It was actually designed as an airport of the Soviet closed city, right? So it's not supposed to be a place where planes from all around the world will come. In the very first day of the full-scale aggression, this airport was bombed, so it's not existent anymore. Most probably after the war, there will be a new, bigger, really global open one. We'll see. But one could say that there is kind of a tension like that. And the next point, this entire story of industrialization is, of course, as always, but also in this case, is the story of migration. Because if we are talking about this rapid development or building of plants and factories, the same it would be true for Manchester itself, or for Polish Łódź, or for German Chemnitz, and name it. I mean, you need a lot of workers immediately, like tomorrow or today. And the same happened in Katerinoslav and later on in Soviet Dnipropetrovsk. So people from all around the empire, they were not. There are some statistical data, you could find them in the book, but I could tell you very briefly that, for instance, the majority of industrial workers in late imperial Katerinoslav, they were not local Ukrainian peasants. They were mostly, let's say, young men from the neighboring Russian regions like Kursk, Voronezh, Orel, and so on. And as we could imagine, as we know, a lot of them stayed. So they just stayed. They spent like the rest of their lives in Katerinoslav. That is why you have this huge and fascinating debate, for instance, in the early Soviet Ukraine, about the fact that the working class, the proletariat, is very much Russian in the republic, and the peasantry is Ukrainian, and what should be done about it. So again, like, you have this interesting combination of, let's say, national and social issues, yeah, put together in a new context. And what's interesting here, actually, I would say that the city somehow, because of its history, was and remained a city of migrants. Seriously, think about it. So we have this, like, first of all, we have like the first big influx of migrants is, of course, in the late 18th century, because the city is created almost like out of nothing. There are some Cossack settlements around, but they are not big. They are not big. So it means like you need new people for the new city. Then industrialization again. Then the First World War. uh, the city was one of the actually biggest centers of internal migration. So refugees, yeah, as we say nowadays, temporarily displaced persons from the western parts of the empire. Then you have Soviet project, again, this rocket project. So again, many migrants, many people sent to work there. And even nowadays, you see, let's not forget that a lot of people who evacuated themselves from the war in Kharkiv Oblast, in Donetsk Oblast, in Kherson Oblast, they actually moved to Dnipro, so the biggest city which is not far away from the front line, also nowadays. So one could say that this migration, this importance of people who are coming to the place, it's one of the, yeah, it's like the repeating topic or the repeating issue in this in the city's history. And that's actually interesting because usually the integration of those migrants, people who migrated, yeah, it happened pretty quickly and peacefully. So in this sense, it's also kind of an interesting, again, like, historical experience to reflect on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so many points to bring up here because the just this last issue of migration, I see parallels to what's going on today with internally displaced Ukrainians that are going there now, that are on the front line and going to places close to there, and also places like Kryvyi Rih to go to hospitals, and it's become this sort of hub for people that are moving, but. I think your book sort of helps us understand that this process has been in motion for hundreds of years in many ways, and I think that the segment on industrialization really struck out or stuck out to me because, well, for a couple of things. First of all, it's just amazing all the different types of people that were coming into the city. I mean, the multiculturalism is fascinating. And, when I teach European history, I always have my students read this article from a few years ago that's about Belgian industrialization in Ukraine to get them to start thinking, how these places maybe aren't so distant in our minds, right? They're more linked than they would ever know, and they read about Hughes and Husovka and these types of places that you were just talking about. And I think it's really fascinating. And I think that somebody should write a dissertation or something on travel logs of people going to Dnipro, because you use some of these, and it's about these sort of interpretations of what a city is. And as you sort of point out, some of them have no idea what they're talking about at all. They're just kind of rambling. But I think it's fascinating about thinking about what a periphery is and what it's not. And if you do anything in this book, it's that you show that this isn't a periphery; this is a major hub. And you sort of tell us about this entangled history from the beginning. And I also think that something that's understated in the book that I'd like to hear more about, not today maybe, but a different time, and to hear you write another history, is the environmental history behind it. I mean, there's so much in terms of, you talk about taming nature, and there's mentions of Dnipro and all these projects, and I think that the city plays a crucial role in that. But I guess my bigger question that I just kind of want to come back to is, when all these people came together, this multiculturalism during industrialization and afterwards, you have a really important segment in the book on Jewish history and the pogroms, especially in 1905 and thereafter. And I kind of just want to hear a little bit more about the sort of Jewish history of the city. And I would be curious too, to kind of know how that history is incorporated today in interpretations in places like museums and stuff. What that history looks like, as they sort of think back about these sort of difficult relationships that were taking place, because there was a lot of violence against the Jewish population at that time. And I'm curious how the city has sort of absorbed and remembered that now.
Yeah, sure. I should tell you that when I started writing this book and looking for sources, I was amazed myself about the amount of evidence in many languages of the Jewish past of Katerinoslav Dnipro. It's really impressive. I would even dare to say that this complex, fascinating cultural, political history, of Jewish life in this place, it could and should be compared to the Jewish past in Odessa, in Vilnius. But if, in case of Odessa or Vilnius, we have so many books, like detailed descriptions, in this case, we have not so many. And that is why I decided, it was my deliberate decision, to pay enough attention to, let's say, for instance, people like Menachem Mendel Ussishkin, a prominent figure in Zionist movement, who actually became prominent exactly in Katerinoslav, so not somewhere else, but right there. Or about this incredibly interesting, fascinating person, this Jewish Russian lawyer and a theoretician, Ilya Arshansky, who was one of the first in the Russian Empire to argue that the Jews should have all the same rights as other subjects of the Russian Empire. So the guy, again, lived in Katerinoslav, died there. His grave, unfortunately, was destroyed in early Soviet years. Typical story, because all the old cemeteries were destroyed. I also try to describe this story in the book. And you could go on and on. So I could give you so many names, also writers, or sculptors, or painters, and so on. On the other hand, as you rightly mentioned, we have the story of the pogroms, and I decided to look really deeper into it, seriously, to understand what actually happened. Because in 1905, so the so-called First Russian Revolution, right? The pogrom in Katerinoslav was apparently the biggest, or one of the biggest and cruelest in the entire Russian Empire. So we are talking about a very serious outbreak of mass violence, urban violence. And then, of course, we also have pogroms in the revolutionary years, so 1919 mostly. That's the worst year for the Jewish population of Ukraine. Then, of course, we have the Holocaust. And again, this the place where the Jews of Dnipropetrovsk were shut down in late autumn 1941. That's actually the place on the territory of the local university. So, believe me, it's the place where, every day for 5 years, being a student, I went. We all have, we have to went through it, through this park. So it's really, that's one of the parts of the story I was really planning to write a longer personal account about, but it's not in the book. So why I'm saying that, this history deserves a very serious research. Unfortunately, in the previous histories of the city, published in Ukrainian and Russian, because again, all the previous histories, they are only in Ukrainian and Russian. Usually, the Jewish aspect is not really well presented. Okay, and that was also part of my motivation to pay bigger attention to it in my book, because it's rather it was never systematically done in this sense. Even though, if you look at the newest developments, let's say again, like last 5 years, one should say that there are very good publications about the Jewish past in Ukrainian language. Yeah, there is a center, the center called the Tkuma Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, where a lot of colleagues of mine work, and actually they helped me. So it's also important that some pictures in the book they were taken from the archive of this Jewish museum in Dnipro. So nowadays it looks pretty impressive. And again, let me stress it again: in Dnipro, we have this huge menorah Jewish community center. It's a unique building or object, not just for Ukraine, for Europe for sure. I would dare to say for the entire world. So you have a huge territory with the synagogue, but also conference halls, libraries, restaurants, hotels, name it, all of it. And actually, when in the year 2019 we organized the summer school in Dnipro, of course, I immediately connected my friends in this menorah center, and they gladly agreed. So we've had our mostly German summer school in this menorah center. It was no problem at all. On the contrary, what is important here again nowadays? Again, talking about like independent Ukraine, right? The Jewish life or the Jewish community is really well integrated into the city's life and city's activity. One could also and should probably talk about the revival of Jewish life that happened largely due to the activity of the rabbi who came from New York to Dnipro. Yeah, Rabbi Kamenetsky, a prominent pupil of Rabbi Schneerson, so a very famous and important figure in the history of Hasidism, who actually also had family ties to the city, so to Dnipro, and all of it. So again, I would dare to say that nowadays there are no bigger problems in a sense let's say lack of information or lack of monuments. There are also monuments, also important monument in this place that I've mentioned, so where the Jews were killed by the Nazis in 1941. Still, actually, there is a Schneerson Street in Dnipro. I'm very happy about it. So there is a street renamed after Schneerson very recently. It happened 5 years ago. So it's a new development. At the same time, it does not mean, of course, that all the problems are solved. Not at all. I would say I'll just give let me give one example. I would say it's very important to write, to rethink and write again a proper history of Jewish Yiddish literature in late 19th, early 20th century Katerinoslav, if possible, entangled with the history of Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish literatures in the time. And again, believe me, I have found some materials about it after the book was published. So hopefully I'll do it at some point also myself. But it's really amazing how the Jewish cultural life flourished in the 1920s and how it was all stopped in late 1920s. So when Stalin actually started this, let's say, this entire project of collectivization, 5-year plan, and cultural revolution in the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, the story of the 20s is less known as it deserves to be known. So there are some aspects to be done here. But again, let me stress it again. At present moment, the Jewish component or the Jewish past, is really integrated into the image of the city. Actually, quite often it is called the Jewish capital of Ukraine, which I also find a very nice, very nice name indeed. And it's also integrated into the city's historical narratives, even though, again, I'm looking forward a new Ukrainian language synthetic book of the city history, because the books we have, they were published earlier, and they were unfortunately influenced by this, mostly Soviet tendency, and not to stress the Jewish presence at all. Yeah, so in Soviet narrative, as we know, not just in the context of the Second World War, but especially in the context of the war, Jewish victims were just called peaceful citizens. Peaceful citizens, and and yeah. So this has to be changed, and I think what I've did in my book, so I've tried to show that at least if we know from statistical data that the Jewish population constituted almost 40% or more than 30% for sure of the city population in late 19th century, it deserves also the proper amount of historiographical attention in the book about it, and that's how I that's how I decided to divide those parts. And I hope it would be of some interest also for specialists in Jewish history.
Yeah, absolutely it will, and I think it's critically important. I thought it was a really it gave us a good taste of things that we can do to study that history more fully. I think, and I think a lot of people will read this and pick up on that, and start to think about how they can write histories of all those things that you just mentioned. So I have one more question for you as we sort of conclude and wrap up our interview. I was thinking back to sort of how you started this book, talking about how people thought of Dnipro in 2013, 2014, and this sort of stereotype as in your quoted words in the book, stereotypical Eastern Ukraine, but how it's not that simple. And these binaries of how we view Ukraine and these cities more generally is insufficient for understanding the complexity of all these places. And I sort of, as I was moving through the book, I was sort of startled by some parallels of the way that the Russian Empire viewed southern Ukraine and specifically Katerinoslav as, a place of chaos that needed to be made unchaotic, and then thinking today about what Russia is doing to Ukraine, waging this war on Ukraine. They have they're different, but just similar features of the way that they view Ukraine. And through all of this, your book, also made me think about the way that Ukraine and Ukrainians are starting to view the entangled histories of these regions. And I don't know if I would say it's being untangled, because you can't untangle a past, but you can work through the tanglements, right? And I think that your book does this well of sort of helping us engage in these difficult conversations and to understand the ways that these features have been constructed. And so I guess I just want to ask you now, in our concluding thoughts, um, what role do you think the city of Dnipro plays in thinking about these historical processes as we move forward, um, hopefully to the conclusion of this war and the victory for Ukraine sooner than later? Does the city offer us any lessons about how to think toward the future of Ukraine and thinking about Ukrainian cities?
Hmm. Yeah, that's not an easy question. Um, on the one hand, let's put it this way. I was very happy, I was very happy to figure out when the book was already published that another book about Kharkiv also just came out. Why I'm saying that? I believe that we need more biographies of at least bigger Ukrainian cities to be included into, it's international academic debate, academic life. Because I would also say it could help us to feel that, first of all, it's not just, let's say, Ukrainian in ethnic or whatever sense. It's much broader. So it is directly linked to the people and processes that we already know, like this example I've mentioned, the Zionism. So again, if you need to understand properly uh, let's say the starting points, the development of Zionist movement, you should go to Dnipro and have a closer look, and not just look on Herzl and Vienna and stuff like that, right? And again, and so on, in many other cases as well. At the same time, I think that any history, also the history of this place, maybe not teaches, but somehow suggests us that we historians or we people who are striving to understand what's going on we could not know the future. I mean, we could, of course, like speculate about it or make some predictions, but we don't know it. And I also tried to give some quotes from different sources, how different, like clever people from the past, how they tried to grasp the future which is coming. For instance, some would say, ah, there is no hope for economic development of this place because of the nature, yeah, because of the Dnipro River and the rapids and how it's all done, yeah. Some other architect would say right before the Second World War, like that he has a great plan for for rethinking of the entire like city center and whatever. And it was like this article was published like literally like a couple of months before the attack of the Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, and so on. I think we should be cautious, really, in our attempts to predict like what could happen or what could we learn from it. But at the same time, and that amazes me indeed, at the same time, one could still see kind of continuation or some like lines that are going through the centuries, like the one about the migrants that we just said, or for instance some even metaphors used to define this city, like the metaphor of like a place uh, being groundless or having not enough foundation. It could be found in different literary texts from the 18th century up to nowadays, and even though like the context is completely different, there is still this feeling that that it's like it's step, yeah, it's south, it's all like moving fast, and like who knows where it brings us. So I think that it's normal and it's very much okay that Dnipro, as well as the entire Ukrainian people, tries to, somehow redefine itself also nowadays. Tries to, that's certainly so, tries to rethink its imperial and Soviet past. Because again, you see, this particular city played enormous role in Russian imperial project, for Catherine II, but also later on for Nicholas II, who visited the city as well. So you have the entire like this modern Russian Empire there from beginning, till the end, and for the Soviet Union, of course. Yeah, because as you already mentioned, Brezhnev, but also before that, and now, of course, the war that came to Ukraine from Russia, this war ideologically is very much based on different types of, let's say, mythologies, yeah, from the Russian Empire and from the Soviet Union. And now imagine, like, you live in a place where, let's say, a huge part of its history, a lot of objects, buildings, right, they actually bear this presence and importance of both like imperial and Soviet narratives, and you want to prove to yourself and probably to the world that it's not who we are. It's maybe part of our past, but it's not like our, let's say, present day identity. Yeah, even if Putin believes so, right? So that's not an easy situation. Seriously, that's not an easy situation. And I think that people who live there, not just politicians, also like just normal people, they're trying to find ways how to do that. I could tell you that in my own view, I'm very cautious here again because, of course, I'm not living there at the moment. But still, as a historian, I would say that we should not be afraid of the past. I mean, imperial past or Soviet, because it happened. You could not pretend it was not there. You could not pretend Brezhnev was not the first secretary of the local, branch of the Communist Party, or that it was not the center of rocket industry, rocket missile industry of the Soviet Union, or that Catherine II visited the place. And also, we have this correspondence, between the empress and Potemkin and stuff like that. I think that nowadays Ukraine should not be afraid of it. It should just somehow clearly formulate or say that what happened in the past does not imply then that's the social reality we have nowadays. And if we are kind of like logical, pragmatic, educated people, it's not an it's easy to understand that it's the same as it was in many other parts of Europe, of course. And then this political danger somehow disappears, at least in my belief, and we should just proceed with a serious research and serious conversation about it. And in order to make this conversation not just responsive but also interesting, in my view, it should be complex. So it should not be limited to just one aspect of it. It should include, as I've tried in my book, it should include like all those sometimes confronting, parts and visions. But it does not mean that this, let's say, Soviet past or imperial past, somehow denies or makes impossible for Ukraine to become a successful European state nowadays. In my view, on the contrary, it's actually about this responsible and critical attitude to what have happened to our ancestors. And we'll see. I'm observing myself what's going on there. It's too early to conclude. Seriously, in my view, it's too early to conclude because every war, and it's such a full scale war, for sure, it yeah, it brings a lot of dynamics into political and social debates, and that's normal. It's nothing like it's understandable, yeah. But still, keeping all that in mind, we as historians, we could not know the future. So the future is opened. The future is always open. It's like, it depends on our actions, on our decisions, on our thoughts also, like decisions made every day, every second. And you could not just say it will be this or that. No, it's always open. So actually, I will be very happy if somehow in parts of this book I've managed to give this feeling of openness of historical development, because that's what we're dealing with.
Mhm. I think it's a beautiful way to end. And as a historian, I couldn't agree more. We can't be afraid of the history. It is complex, and we need to understand it and write those complexities. And it's a notorious line in the historical profession that historians are terrible predictors of the future. There's a great lyric in a song from one of my friend's bands from a small town, Loveland, Colorado, called "Shooting Down Satellites." They're no longer together, but they had a line in one of their songs called "The future is unwritten, authors wanted." Right, and so I think that's where we have to leave it. But Andrii, I want to thank you so much for doing this podcast interview. For those of you listening, we were talking today about Andrii's new book. It's called Dnipro, An Entangled History of a European City. Please pick it up and read it and engage with these paths. Andrii, thank you so much.
Thank you so much again. Дякую дуже.